And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Matt Devine, who is a partner at PwC. Matt has proven experience navigating complex regulatory requirements and multi-stakeholder engagements. Matt will say a few words about PwC and introduce Ambassador Rice, at which point I will return to have a conversation with the ambassador. Matt, thank you to you, Jason, and the entire PwC team for all of your support.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce our next speaker. As Sonia mentioned, we live in a complex geopolitical world. Canada's in the middle of so many, things going on. Just looking at the news, events in the Middle East. I think a lot of people probably looked at the debates last night. So there's a lot of things to stay abreast of now. It's difficult to navigate through these waters, and that's why I'm particularly interested for the speaker that will be coming up shortly to help us with this. You'll see a lot of lines on the papers here as I was editing the introduction. There's so much to say about this speaker. It took me a little bit of time even just to narrow it down, but I'll do my best. So Ambassador Susan Rice most recently served as assistant to the President and Domestic Policy Advisor in the Biden administration. As Director of Domestic Policy Council, she drove the formulation and implementation of President Biden's domestic policy agenda. Her responsibilities spanned a vast array of issues, and I'm just going to pick a few here: healthcare, veteran affairs, immigration, artificial intelligence, and homelessness, just to name a few. There's about 15 other ones that I didn't put down, so incredible background. Ambassador Rice played a leading role in many critical Biden administration accomplishments, including crafting the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, greatly expanding access to affordable health care, the Inflation Reduction Act, and gun violence prevention legislation. She's also served under the Obama and Clinton administrations, and she's the only person to ever have served as both National Security Advisor and Domestic Policy Advisor. She has been a visiting fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government, and she's an opinion writer for the New York Times. She served on boards in several global organizations, both private and non-profit sectors, as a New York Times bestselling author of Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. PwC is a proud sponsor of the GRI Summit. We believe in bringing perspectives together to solve important problems and to achieve what matters most. To that end, I know we'll all benefit from the unique perspectives and experience of our next speaker, so please join me in welcoming Ambassador Susan Rice, who will be in conversation with Sonia.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Matt, for that wonderful introduction of Susan. Before we get started, if you are in CVent and you go to the session, if you have questions to ask of Ambassador Rice, I will collect them in my iPad that's just been handed to me and incorporate them as I go, because I'm going to try to sort of walk us through a bit of a path here, and so put your questions in as you go, and I'll incorporate them through the process. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today, Ambassador. I thought maybe we would start with, as Matt described, you've had a really interesting and successful career. But maybe start with a little bit of how you got there, a little bit of your background. I think you've got a very interesting family history, and all of those things have, I'm sure, contributed to the path you took in public service. So I think it would be great to share some of that with our audience.
Well, first of all, thank you, Sonia, and thank you to GRI for having me, and good morning, everybody. It's really great to be with you. Great to be back in Toronto, which is a place that my husband and I have lived at various times in our lives and our careers, and it's wonderful to be back in Canada, which is my second home country by marriage. But about my American family ties, I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. In the mid-'60s, and I was really privileged to be born to parents who had very interesting backstories themselves. My mother was the child of immigrants from Jamaica who left Jamaica in 1912 and took banana boats to Portland, Maine, and raised their family in Portland, Maine, where, as you might imagine, there weren't a lot of people at the time who looked much like me. My grandparents had no education. My grandfather was a janitor. My grandmother was a maid and a seamstress. And yet, like so many immigrants who've come to our country and to Canada, they saved and they scraped and they prioritized education, and they were able to send all 5 of their children to college. My mother was the youngest of the 5 and the only girl. Her brothers included 2 doctors, a university president, and an ophthalmologist, optometrist. And my mother, the baby, went to Radcliffe College, as you now know, part of Harvard. Her brothers had all gone to Bowdoin College in Maine, and my grandfather was the first man to ever have 4 sons graduate from Bowdoin College. But my mother couldn't go there because she was a girl and it was still all boys. She went to Harvard and was president of not just her class, but the entire student body, as one of only 3 black women in her class, and went on to devote her career to enabling other people who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether minorities or economically disadvantaged, to have the opportunities that she had to go to college. She was known as the mother of the Pell Grant, which in the United States is a federal grant established now 50 years ago that has enabled more than 80 million Americans to get a higher education. She also was a leader in the corporate world. She sat on 11 corporate boards at a time when really women were at the vanguard of corporate board service. My dad had a very different story. He was born and raised in segregated South Carolina, born in 1920. He was the grandson of a slave who fought in the Union Army during the Civil War and went on to get a college education and to found a school for black boys and girls in New Jersey known as the Bordentown School, which for 70 years educated generations of African Americans, not only in skills and trades, but also on a college preparatory path. And so my father, with that background and really unusual history of higher education for somebody coming up when he did as an African American, he served in World War II with the Tuskegee Airmen in a segregated military, which he found scarring, I think is an honest term, to be fighting for the freedom of everybody but one's own people. He would go off the base and not be able to be served in restaurants and see German POWs getting served in the same places. And so it really was a formative experience for him. He went on to get his PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. He was a professor at Cornell. He served at the World Bank and in the Treasury Department, and ultimately was a governor of our Federal Reserve System. So here with these 2 parents who had come from both difficult backgrounds, but with real success and ambition, my brother and I were very blessed to get great educations in Washington, D.C., in the best schools that the city could offer. We were taught to believe that we could grow up to be whoever we wanted to be at a time when that seemed, unusual to say the least. And so my parents taught us that with that privilege comes enormous responsibility. The responsibility to serve somebody more than yourself, And so I was instilled from the earliest days with a spirit of public service. They weren't prescriptive about how it could manifest itself, but the expectation was that we were to do something that was beneficial to the broader community.
Well, so you've delivered that in spades, to say the least. Ambassador, you've uniquely served as the UN ambassador, the national security advisor, and the domestic policy advisor, something that no one else has done. Maybe share a little bit about these roles, how they intersect with the current challenges that we're facing, and there are probably you could spend the whole time answering that question, but.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about the current challenges.
Yes.
I trust. But certainly, as ambassador to the United Nations and as national security advisor, one is on the forefront of wrestling with the most difficult challenges of the day. And so many of the issues that are in the headlines as we speak, the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, tensions in Asia and China's role, the horrific humanitarian crisis in Sudan. All of these are issues that I dealt with in both of those roles. I spent countless hours across the negotiating table from my Chinese and Russian counterparts, as well as allied partners. Many of the people who are in decision-making roles in capitals around the world are the very same people that I worked with 10 plus years ago. I feel like these issues, sadly, sometimes feel like they're only getting more and more intractable, but they're quite familiar in many respects to me. And then, of course, on the domestic side, in case anybody might have caught a bit of the debate last night, the issues that were front and center, from gun violence to reproductive rights to immigration to healthcare policy, these were all my responsibility as domestic policy advisor under President Biden. So I feel like, for better or for worse, I'm well prepared to watch things like the debate.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe I'll zero in on one of the areas that is particularly relevant and important to Canadians and to the financial sector, and that's the subject of tariffs. And both Donald Trump and the Vice President Harris have identified maybe different versions, but of protectionist type tariffs. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you would assess each of their approaches, and maybe a little bit about protectionism as within that.
Well, it's interesting. In the United States, we might use different terminology, but let me try to dissect the differences. I think there are very stark differences, frankly, between the approaches of former President Trump and Vice President Harris when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to economic policy more broadly. But focusing for a second on tariffs, what Donald Trump has said he will do, were he to be elected again, is to impose up to a 20% tariff on all goods coming into the United States from everywhere around the world, as well as 60% tariffs on everything coming from China. The immediate impact of that on the American family will be to cost them an average of $4,000 a year in additional costs at a time when we all know that inflation and financial pressures are quite severe. That is a wildly indiscriminate approach to trade policy that has no foundation in any specific concerns about a particular sector or a particular set of products that we might have some reason to take care about. As Canada knows better than almost anybody, under the prior Trump administration, tariffs were wielded wildly with claims that are of national security significance when we have no deeper, closer friendship and ally and partner than Canada. There is no national security threat that Canadian steel poses to the United States. And now it seems that approach would be, under a new Trump administration, vastly expanded and done so indiscriminately. What Vice President Harris has said is that there are particular sectors and particular countries of concern, and China does remain of concern. But even with respect to China, the notion of 60% across-the-board tariffs is not something that anybody in a Harris administration would contemplate. They've been very specific about particular sensitive items, and you've heard my successor, Jake Sullivan, talk about small yards with high fences. These are terms for how we are intending to protect the supply chain for critical supplies, deny China access to the most high-tech equipment, including the most sophisticated semiconductor chips for things like artificial intelligence. That is a very different approach than punishing the American consumer and friends and allies indiscriminately. And so I do think we're in an era that's different than it was 10 years ago when, under the Obama administration, we were hoping to implement the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have included Canada. And while we had, obviously, particular trade disputes, we'll never forget softwood lumber and salmon, we nonetheless were broadly aligned and understood that we treat friends and allies as friends and allies, and when we have economic disputes, we work them out rather than bludgeon each other with clubs.
Right. Thank you for that. Maybe the other sort of key policy that's particularly impactful to Canada is the view on interest rates. And we've had, past President Trump has declared that he should have a say on interest rate setting. Vice President Harris has had the opposite view on that. Given this, divergence in view, how do you see the White House-Fed relations evolving under either of these candidates?
Well, as everybody here knows, we have a long tradition in the United States of Federal Reserve independence. Yeah. And the president, whether Democratic or Republican, has never sought to meddle in or queer Fed decision-making about interest rates or monetary supply or any other critical issues. For Donald Trump now to say that he intends to seek to impact Fed decision-making on critical issues is unprecedented and deeply concerning. Vice President Harris has been very clear that she will honor the longstanding tradition of the White House and the administration staying out of Fed decision-making. That's the appropriate approach. And I think that the proposed Trump approach really has some significant risks. If you look at the composition of the Fed right now, we have Jay Powell, who was originally a Trump appointee, reappointed by President Biden. I think there's some reason to be concerned that if Trump were to be elected, that he would get rid of Jay Powell before his term expired. 5 of the 7 governors now are Biden appointees. 2 held over from Trump, not including Jay Powell, who I'm counting in the Biden category for simplicity's sake. And Donald Trump is unlikely to have any near-term vacancies to fill, and yet, he will most likely, I think, find himself, kind of going to war with the Fed, which is not anything that lends stability to our domestic market, to Canada, to the international environment. So, one can hope that that's rhetoric, but Donald Trump flirted with this while he was president, He tried and failed to appoint sort of stooge, unqualified governors. Those that are on, that he did appoint, maintain quite a strong ideological affinity to President Trump and his approaches, but they're outvoted. So I think under Harris on this issue, we're going to have, we would have stability and continuity. Under a Trump presidency, we could see something quite different.
Yeah, which could potentially have significant impacts, well, around the world, not just here in Canada. Ambassador, when you left the White House, you said, and I quote, "While there are many intractable domestic issues, I dare say that there may be more internationally." Maybe you could, I think there are some obvious ones. There are some obvious ones, but I think it goes beyond the obvious ones. The geopolitical environment, maybe is as complex as it's ever been in terms of sort of fundamental democracy in many ways. So maybe a little bit about just sort of broadly speaking, and then maybe we can narrow it down to some of the specific issues.
Well, I said that in May of 2023, which is at the end of May is when I left the Biden administration. And I hate to say that events have continued to bear out that assessment. We'll talk about the Middle East, Russia and Ukraine. We've got a major war in Europe for the first time in a long time. We have, of course, China and its approach in the Asia-Pacific, increasingly aggressive. But what we also are seeing, and this is new, relatively new, is an extremely tightening alignment between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And we see that in the flow of weapons to Russia in the context of the war in Ukraine. We see that in the so-called dual-use trade between China and Russia. We see North Korean and Iranian hardware on the battlefield in Ukraine. And so this nexus, which I would call an axis of authoritarianism, is a significant new dynamic that is going to be a challenge for the United States and our allies in NATO and Asia to reckon with. I mentioned, and I want to continue to remind folks that those aren't the only parts of the world that are experiencing real difficulty. And very undercovered and underappreciated is what is happening in Sudan again today, where for over a year we've had a brutal civil war that's led to the recurrence of mass atrocities in Darfur and other parts of Sudan, hunger, starvation, malnutrition, lack of hospitals, huge displacement on a scale that exceeds anything we've seen anywhere else on the planet at the moment. And yet very little public and media attention to it. This is a challenge that the United States and others have been working to try to resolve, to improve humanitarian access, to end the conflict, to disentangle the outside players like the United Arab Emirates, among others, who are actively involved in stoking that conflict. But there is a lot going on in the world, and plenty for my colleagues and successors to wrestle with.
So maybe just in terms of all of that, the role of NATO, and how do you see the U.S. role in NATO changing? Clearly, it's quite different impacts depending on where things happen, where things fall out with the upcoming election. But there are key impacts on European, Asian security and defense spending, and the approach of either of these candidates, and maybe even also comment on responses to Canada and our defense spending, because I think that's a big issue, likely no matter who the candidate, who is successful in the election.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that NATO really has never been more important than it is today. And the alliance is stronger, it's larger with the addition of Finland and Sweden, and that's hugely important. An unintended consequence of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is that NATO has awakened, NATO is unified, NATO has played an indispensable role in support of Ukraine. In the United States, we tend to think that it's all the United States carrying the water financially and otherwise in Ukraine. That's not the truth. The truth is Europe and the other NATO allies have done as much and more in terms of financial expenditures and military assistance to Ukraine. So this has been an extraordinary partnership and a necessary one, because recall the history. In 2008, Putin invaded Georgia, still occupies parts of Georgia. 2014, he invaded Ukraine and occupied Crimea and the eastern parts of the Donbass, stayed there, and then in 22 launched an effort to try to take over the entirety of Ukraine. And make no mistake, his intent is to try to succeed in eating Ukraine and continue moving to the West, whether it's Moldova or Poland or the Baltics. We have every reason to be concerned that unless stopped, history will continue to repeat itself and Putin will continue on his path. And so at the critical stage in which we're at now, we've got very starkly different, again, approaches to NATO. I don't need to remind people that Donald Trump has, views NATO and alliances as protection rackets, as things that serve his ego and his interests, not as long-standing security and political partnerships based on shared interests and shared values. He's been very clear that he feels no obligation to come to the defense of NATO allies, and uses the excuse that they are not paying, as he would say, the United States 2% or more of their GDP, so Putin can do whatever the hell he wants. That's a very different approach than what you've seen under President Biden, what you would see under a President Harris, who understands the critical value and importance of our alliances in transatlantic as well as in Asia, and will nurture and invest in those alliances rather than denigrate and diminish them. But on the issue of Canada and Canada's defense spending, they are, of the 32 countries in NATO, 23 have now met their commitment, which they all made in 2014 at the NATO summit. I was there, I was National Security Advisor, that by 2024, each of the NATO countries would be spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense. This is, long before the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Canada today, if I'm not mistaken, is spending still only 1.37%. And rather than meeting the commitment that Prime Minister Harper made to President Obama and to his NATO allies that by this year you would be at 2%, we now have Prime Minister Trudeau saying, well, perhaps by 2032. That's not credible in the world in which we live. And it's not acceptable. The other country is as significant and important as Canada, needs to pull its weight. And I say this as somebody, thank you. I say this as somebody who loves Canada, who understands Canada's importance and significance to the world and to the United States. And the difference will be that Vice President Harris, as president, will say it the way I just did, straightforward, truthfully, but from a position of friendship. Canada needs to play its role. But she's not going to pull out a NORAD and just, refuse to defend Canada in the event that you get there slower than you were supposed to get there. We do not view, and she does not view the U.S.-Canada alliance and partnership as something that's purely transactional. But Canada on its own should, frankly, be embarrassed by breaking its commitment and by being on such a slow path to do what many NATO countries that have far less wherewithal than Canada have already accomplished. So I think it's interesting that this is not, a topic that gets more public and popular attention here than it might in other parts of NATO. But I think, as influential voices in Canada, I encourage you to pay attention to this, because it's not a sustainable situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me move now to a couple of questions, and we will get to the Middle East. I'm holding that one for now. But I've got quite a few questions that have come in about Ukraine and Russia, and really, what do you see as the potential future? Without, is there an end that is foreseeable to this without Ukraine giving up territory at the end of the day?
Well, I think it's, first of all, important to remember that Ukraine began this war without all of its territory.
Yes, absolutely. And
that Crimea is Ukrainian, and so is the Donbass in the east of Ukraine. A return to the status quo ante may be an outcome that is achieved at the negotiating table, but it is not a long-term solution, and it doesn't end the reality that Russia continues to occupy important parts of Ukraine. But I think what we're seeing, frankly, right now is Vladimir Putin waiting to see the outcome of the U.S. election. And not just waiting, massively interfering in our election, as he's done in the past, but at a scale and a scope that is perhaps on a different level this time. Because his intention this time is not simply to undermine democracy and Americans' faith in democracy and to exacerbate our domestic political divisions and further pit Americans against one another. It is very explicitly to see Donald Trump elected and see Donald Trump put on the table a plan of capitulation and appeasement with respect to Ukraine. So Putin is playing for time to some extent while he works to manipulate the outcome in the United States. If he fails and Kamala Harris is elected, I think that changes his calculus as well as that of our Ukrainian partners, because then he is faced with a longer-term, much more enduring and costly commitment. The Russians have already lost well over 500,000 casualties. As you know, they are emptying jails and expending, time, money, and treasure. So obviously is Ukraine, paying an extremely high price. But I think the calculation becomes different if this looks like it will not be quickly resolved by a Donald Trump waving the white flag on January 21st. And so, NATO and our partners need to remain steadfast in support of Ukraine. It's very important, I think, that the frozen assets of Russia be made available to Ukraine to be able to support its effort to equip and sustain itself. This is going to require some more time and investment from NATO partners, but nobody is making more investment and sacrifice than the Ukrainian people themselves. And then, ultimately, obviously, this ends at the negotiating table. but Ukraine needs to be at the negotiating table from a position of strength. And that requires Vladimir Putin to realize that he's facing down a very long road and a very costly continued commitment.
Right. China, let's touch on China for a moment, on maybe the state of U.S. China relations and how you see that unfolding differently under the two potential scenarios of leadership, and maybe also AI. It sort of comes into play, particularly when we think about the China question, and comment on that.
Well, let me talk first about the bilateral relationship.
Yes. Yeah.
And AI, yes, that absolutely bleeds over into the China thing, but it's also its own set of challenges,
yes.
As you indicated in your opening. The U.S. China bilateral relationship is at a difficult and challenging point. It is more stable than it was before the Leaders Summit last November in San Francisco. Prior to that, you'll recall the balloon incident and many other things that were, and Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the aftermath of that, which had led to a really rocky low point. When the leaders met, as is often the case, to use terminology that we use in Washington, we sort of put a floor under the bilateral relationship. Things started not to go further down and to stabilize and indeed begin to improve. Some important understandings came out of that summit. We restored and have maintained now mill-to-mill communications so that the risk of an unintended incident that could lead to a wider conflict has been reduced because we have hotlines and communications restored. The Chinese have taken some significant steps to deal with fentanyl precursors, which is a very important issue for the United States. We've had high-level dialogue both between the leaders and between foreign ministers and the like. So things are stable, but stable at a relatively low level. And there's several issues that are front and center now in the relationship. The Philippines and China's aggression, unlawful aggression in the South China Sea, and pushing the envelope with the Second Thomas Shoal and other features in the South China Sea. The United States has a treaty commitment to the Philippines. The Philippines are a U.S. ally. And as we have said to the Chinese on many occasions, if you spark a conflict with the Philippines, you're basically sparking a conflict with the United States, and don't go there. That is one important issue. Another important issue, of course, is Taiwan, where China has said that they are committed to reunification through whatever means necessary. China is not happy with the fact that the United States continues to uphold our obligations to support Taiwan through military sales. And there's, on the 10th of this month, a major speech that the Taiwanese president will be giving that the Chinese are watching very closely, very concerned that he might say things that they choose to interpret as indications of a desire towards independence, so that we have a near-term difficult moment through which to navigate. And then third big issue, and I would say from the U.S. point of view, it's currently the biggest issue, is China's dramatic and very significant support for Russia's war in Ukraine. And China will say, well, we're not sending arms and military supplies, but they are sending vast quantities of equipment and inputs that are critical to Russia's war effort, and doing so under the guise of it being dual-use equipment. And this is a very, very sore spot, not only in the U.S.-China relationship, but in the European and Chinese relationship. I had the opportunity last week to meet in New York on the margins of the General Assembly with the Chinese foreign minister. I raised all of these points. This was a track sort of 1.5 dialogue that obviously didn't substitute for the U.S. formal meetings with the Chinese delegation. And the Chinese tone was rather conciliatory in that conversation that I was part of. I've seen all different forms of Wang Yi, the foreign minister, the beating the table form and the mild-mannered form. Last week we got the mild-mannered form for the most part. I think they're not trying to do too much that would be destabilizing in the run-up to the election. I think they're wary of both President Trump, former President Trump, and Vice President Harris for different reasons. Harris because she will maintain a strong commitment to our alliances, both in Europe and in Asia, that she will maintain policies that are restrictive on China's ability to make advances in things like artificial intelligence and quantum and others. Whereas they look at Trump as somebody they can play with and manipulate with financial and other blandishments, but they also know him to be highly unpredictable, and in that sense, hard to anticipate where he'll go. So they're kind of sitting back and looking at this with interest, but I think some degree of trepidation on both sides. So the U.S. China relationship is in a complicated place. I think you will see some continuity on trade policy if Vice President Harris is elected, but you will really see an emphasis on strengthening and shoring up our alliances, which has been a hallmark of the Biden administration in the Asia Pacific, particularly between Japan and South Korea, with the Australians and others, India and Japan. So I think you'll see a good continuity there. Frankly, with President Trump, former President Trump, he has veered wildly between praising Xi Jinping as a great leader and dictator, along with Kim Jong-un, and then talking about the China virus, which is so insulting and denigrating. So I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, probably not including him, exactly how he would approach it.
Right, thank you. And if we zero in on the Taiwan scenario, which I think is of great concern around the world for all the obvious reasons, how do you see that playing out under a potential Trump presidency?
Trump has been clear. He has no interest in defending Taiwan. President Biden has taken a very different approach. He said repeatedly that he would. I don't think Vice President Harris has had to answer that directly herself, but I can assure you she's not going to declare that U.S. is never going to come to Taiwan's defense. That is a green light for Xi Jinping. And frankly, we have to understand the relationship between what's happening in Ukraine and what is understood and perceived on Taiwan. If former President Trump were reelected and came in and struck a deal that was, essentially giving Vladimir Putin what he wants in Ukraine, that is tantamount to telling Xi Jinping that he can get what he wants with respect to Taiwan. And combine that with his oft-repeated statements that he has no commitment to Taiwan's independence, that is a very dangerous scenario. And I imagine where you're going in part is TSMC and the semiconductor facilities in Taiwan, which are critical to Canada, to the United States, to the global economy, and to the West's ability to maintain and sustain our strategic and economic primacy. So to be cavalier about what happens to Taiwan is inexplicable from my point of view and antithetical to our shared interests.
Yeah. Let me turn to the Middle East. I've got a lot of questions here from participants on that, but maybe I'll just frame it as a little more open. It's almost a year to October 7th, the anniversary. The conflict has moved from Gaza and Hamas to Hezbollah and Lebanon. We've seen everybody here has, seen all of how this has unfolded in the last 24 hours. Where do you see all of this going, and what's the path?
Well, I think it's important, and you did this, to go back a year to the horrific terrorist attack that occurred on October 7th, the extraordinary loss of life in Israel, the heart-wrenching stories of sexual violence that transpired, and obviously the trauma that inflicted on Israel, and the many strategic and intelligence and security failures that in part enabled that. And then you go to the war in Gaza, which has been nightmarish, and the human toll, the civilian toll, has been extraordinary. I think one can argue the strategic wisdom of the approach of Israel to defending itself, which it absolutely has the right to do, and the need to do, has been very questionable, the way they've approached the war in Gaza. It's hard to see how, over the long term, that leads to a diminution in extremism among the population. And meanwhile, with right-wing ministers in the Netanyahu government stoking flames in the West Bank, that situation is now boiling. And then, of course, for the last year, from the day after October 7th, we've had Hezbollah lobbing missiles into Israel, and Israel responding. And Israel's response in Lebanon, again, has had already a high civilian toll, but at least there's a strategic logic to what they are trying to do. Taking out Hassan Nasrallah is, a strategic success for Israel and, frankly, for the United States and our interests in the region. Weakening Hezbollah the same, but Israel does not need another 18-year occupation of Lebanon as it's trying to manage the situation in Gaza, which is not over, and deal with the situation in the West Bank, and of course, the other elements of the Iranian axis, including the Houthis in Yemen, which are under discussed, but perhaps one of the more dangerous and unpredictable. So Israel is now at a point where, having experienced again a really meaningful and significant attack from Iran yesterday that exceeded what we saw in April. Their air defense is held, the United States support for Israel held, and thankfully the loss of life was minimal yesterday. But where this goes from here, Israel undoubtedly will feel tempted to use this opportunity to inflict major damage on Iran, and perhaps do so in a way that is especially escalatory. And the danger here is that this spirals into a conflict that involves not just Iran and Israel, but the United States and other partners in the region, that it has massive implications for the global economy when you consider the traffic and the oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz. This is not what the world needs at this moment. It's certainly not what we need in the United States at this moment. And Israel has every need and right to reestablish deterrence and to take this opportunity to degrade Iran's capabilities. But I think it would be very risky for Iran to try to, for example, strike nuclear facilities in Iran, for Israel to try to strike nuclear facilities in Iran. They may do that, and if so, we need to buckle up, because it's going to be a very precarious time.
Yeah, I think one of the places where you see, although the U.S. has continued with their support of Israel, I think one of the challenges is the civilian loss of life and the impact of that. How do you see the U.S. managing that challenge that they have in terms of the continued support of Israel, but the continued loss of civilian life? And I guess the path is different depending on what the leadership looks like in 34 days from today.
Well, so, the United States is walking a fine line here.
Yeah.
We're very clear in our unwavering support for Israel and its right to defend itself. We've also been very clear that the way in which the war in Gaza has been prosecuted, with the extreme humanitarian toll, the loss of civilian life, the denial of humanitarian supplies at various times, the indiscriminate attacks on civilians, in our estimation, has been a strategic error. And yet, the push and the emphasis has been and has to be on ending this conflict in Gaza through a ceasefire, through the return of the hostages. If you had asked me, on October 8th last year, whether a year later there would be more than 100 hostages held and unaccounted for, some obviously now sadly lost, I would have said that's inconceivable. That is, in part because it's so counter to Israeli history and culture, where they have so valued Israeli lives. And you remember Gilad Shalit and how they traded 1,000 people for one. And now these hostages and their families have just suffered enormously for all this time. That's going to have extreme political ramifications, as well as obviously human implications, and implications for how Israel views itself and its identity. And so this ceasefire, the return of the hostages, and an end to the suffering in Gaza is as urgent as it's ever been. And frankly, it is part of the equation to reducing tensions with Hezbollah. Israel has made important gains in degrading and undermining Hamas. It has done the same now with Hezbollah. It has helped to restore Israel's strategic advantage in the region. Once it responds, as it must and it will, in Iran, hopefully in a rational and well-conceived way, this should again be an opportunity for diplomacy to have some greater impact. There's no way out of this without that. And long term, as difficult as it may seem in the moment, the need for a Palestinian state and Israel being able to live in security as a democratic Jewish state in a two-state outcome down the road is the only way that this spiral ends.
Right. So it doesn't appear that a ceasefire is imminent.
No.
And given that, how do you see the current events in this part of the world impacting the outcome of the election, if at all?
it's way too early to judge that. It depends what happens next. It depends whether there's, wider regional war, if there are economic impacts, or if, as in April, there's a counterstrike and a punishment, and then, a reset. So I think that, there are all kinds of things that can happen in the next 35 days that can impact our election. Some exogenous, some endogenous. We've seen, hurricanes. We have a longshoreman strike. We have the state of the world. And we still haven't yet had our October surprise. So,
Well,
we got a long time.
It'll be interesting to see how the October surprise can trump what we've had already.
I would say, look, I'm knocking on wood, but given how the last several months have unfolded, I think we'd all be wise not to assume that it can't get more interesting.
So I want to turn to one of the questions that has been posed. What period in history do you think most closely resembles the current international geopolitical context? And most importantly, what lessons should we take from that period? I know it's a biggie.
Well, it's also, as somebody who's trained as a historian, I know better than to try to make the simple analogies from one era to another. So believe it or not, I'm not going to fall into that trap. I do think that we need to be mindful in all the places that we've been talking about, from Russia, Ukraine to the Asia Pacific, and of course the Middle East, that miscalculation, unintended consequences can drive developments in a way that can be quite concerning. And we're at a moment where they're just, the challenge is that there are a multiplicity of arenas where miscalculation could lead to something quite significant or even more significant. On the other hand, we have been through many more cataclysmic and difficult times than now, and I am comforted by the knowledge that at least on the U.S. side in Washington, we have experienced sober leadership that is well versed in the challenges that we've been discussing, and that will be steady and acting in what, to the greatest extent possible, in the service of U.S. interests rather than in any personal interests or an overtly political way that would be detrimental to the national interest.
Right. I want to kind of bring it all back to this question. Is decorum lost in U.S. and international politics, and how do we get through the rhetoric to deal with the policy?
Is decorum lost? I think decorum is on a long vacation. Although, I don't think it's lost forever, necessarily. It's interesting, as bitter and ugly and divisive as our politics have become, and as much of a outsized role that blatant lies play in the daily discourse. There are still important things that we've been able to do and that President Biden and Congress have been able to do in the last 4 years across partisan lines. And I think that gets lost in the heat and the horse race of a campaign. The Infrastructure Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the most significant investment in our domestic infrastructure, from taking lead out of pipes to laying broadband, and building new roads and airports, huge bipartisan accomplishment. The CHIPS and Science Act, which has given us the ability to try to re-energize and revive our own domestic semiconductor industry and other industries of the future, major bipartisan legislation. The PACT Act, which enables our veterans to receive care and benefits from the kinds of injuries that they've sustained in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where burn pits have been such an enormous challenge. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is the first and most significant piece of gun safety legislation that we've passed in 30 years. These are all things that that give President Biden one of the most exceptional legislative records since Lyndon Johnson. And many of the signature achievements were accomplished on a bipartisan basis. So all is not lost, nor is all doom and gloom. But we need leaders who understand that they are governing for the entirety of the people, whether you are Democrat or Republican, whether you live in a red state or a blue state, rural or urban. That has been the mantra and the approach of Vice President Harris and President Biden. You contrast that, sadly, with leaders on the other side who demonize and denigrate and call out the dogs on their own constituents in their own home states. President Trump, many don't recall, refused to provide assistance to the last hurricane that hit North Carolina because we have a Democratic governor in North Carolina, and then lies about the vast and very impressive federal response to Hurricane Helene. So we need leaders who want to tell the truth, who want to try to minimize and mitigate divisions and remind Americans that there's much, much more that we have in common than what divides us, rather than pitting Americans against each other and making clear that one would completely violate the rule of law with impunity and go after one's political opponents with the full force of the U.S. Justice Department. These are things that we've really never seen in our country before. And we're at such a fragile point that I don't think can count on being able to withstand that kind of threat to the rule of law and to our democracy. And so I think there are many structural things that we can do that can reduce polarization, things like eliminating gerrymandered districts and implementing ranked choice voting. I could go on with a lot of structural ideas and potential reforms. But at the end of the day, we also need to reward leaders who are governing for the greater good rather than the interests of some or even of one.
Ambassador Rice, on that note, we're sadly out of time. I know, I'm sure our I know I have a lot more questions that I did not get to, but we very much appreciate your time, your insights. This has been very, very informative. As you well know, better than anyone, the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is critical. We're interconnected, and we will all be, while most of us can't vote, we will certainly be paying. Some of us can, and I know all that can will. But we will certainly be paying close attention.
Well, thank you very much. It's always great to be back in Canada, and particularly in Toronto. And thank you all for your friendship and your partnership. There's no more important bilateral relationship than the U.S. and Canada. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you.